Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. We are now ready for the next session, the risk spectrum. Please put your hands together for Christoph Rabensneifer, Chris Woodlard, Raquel Ettrick-Thompson, and your moderator, Tommy Reggiori Wilkes.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you had a good break, enjoyed the magnificent view. We're going to be talking about banks, AI, governance and regulation. It's a huge topic and there's lots to get through, so let's get started. I thought I'd begin with you, Chris. You're now at EY, formerly at the FCA, and it'd be great to get your views on the external world of regulation. But to begin, maybe you could just tell us your thoughts on how banks actually approach the issue and should approach the issue of internal AI governance, and then we can hear from our representatives from the two banks.
Sure, thanks very much. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to really think about in terms of sort of setting the stage for how you think about internal governance, and obviously that's shaped by external governance, what's going to happen with the regulators, etc. And we've already had it actually a bit this morning coming out in some of the discussion, which is there may be many, many things that are technically possible, but then there's a question of are they going to fit both within the law, but also are they going to fit within, you know, from a reputational perspective, ethically, you know, what would you like to do? And so, I mean, I think what we're seeing at the moment with a number of our clients is how they're beginning to start to approach this internally is really getting those governance frameworks in early. So how do you actually understand this? How do you make sure that your governors, if you like, so who's exercising governance, really understands the technology as best they can? Have they got the right advisors around them? But then also, how do you begin to put the necessary sort of gateways internally around beginning to deploy this? So where is it okay to experiment? Where is it okay to pilot? Where do you need to actually have perhaps a bit more thought before you're saying this is now going to roll out across the bank in whatever way it may do? I think it's also, you know, real sense in thinking about, you know, what are the things that are internal, and I think we see a lot of interest in that, and what are the things that are going to become client-facing or customer-facing in some way, and applying, frankly, a higher bar to those things, because, frankly, your ability to kind of retreat, realise that maybe you've taken a wrong step is much harder to do when that becomes a client-facing set of questions. I think the other final point to say, just in terms of starting us off, is it's worth remembering, I think, because of the excitement around the technology, we tend to think of this being a very new thing. Because of the AI Act in Europe, we tend to think of this being a very new thing. Actually, most of the regulators are sending messaging at the moment that says, we've had tools to deal with this for years, and there have been principles here to deal with this for years. Now, that's not entirely true, but it is pretty much true. And so, you know, there's a lot of existing learning that can be applied to how you think about governing this and how you think about steering a course that you maximise the benefits, but you stay safe.
Raquel, what's your perspective on this? Tell us a bit what you do at BNY and how you approach the issue of internal governance.
So Chris touched on it. I try to frame it out into 4 simple contexts. The first one is governance. Do you have the right guardrails in place to ensure that the solutions that are being delivered both internally and externally are appropriately governed and managed? Do you have policies and standards in place that help your employees to understand how to use AI responsibly? The second concept is really about measurement. Peter Drucker talks about anything that gets measured gets done. You look at how you're measuring the effectiveness of the solutions, the responsibility, the fairness, the ethics, the accuracy, and the transparency, and overall making sure that the solutions throughout the life cycle are adequately managed. From a mapping perspective, your inventory is crucial. The first thing regulators are going to come and ask you are, what are the solutions that you have deployed, and how are you managing them throughout the life cycle, whether that's the injection phase, meaning the initial initiation, all the way through retirement. How do you know when a model is no longer fit for purpose? And then lastly, I would say managing. And that's everything from end to end, understanding the lineage of the data that you're using, all the way through understanding the controls that are in place to mitigate the potential for data exfiltration.
And Christoph, I mean, clearly one of the issues with AI is that the technology itself is evolving so rapidly, it's changing so rapidly. So how do you factor that into your governance models at Deutsche Bank?
I think that's very important. And I think we have seen in the past, let me say 2 years, a drift from very tactical ad hoc measures to get a grip, get control around generative AI to a more steady state. If I may pick up on Chris' point in the beginning, actually as banks, as financial institutions, we have a good starting point, right? We have a lot of processes with a lot of controls in place which should actually capture generative AI as they would do with any other technology as well. It's no different. The thing I would love to add to the conversation is that before we think about risk, compliance, and even technology architecture, we of course also need to have a governance around our business strategy. Like, what are the use cases actually we want AI to solve? Or what are the applications where we want to use generative AI, large language model, and so on? And I think that's what we have been working on in our organization now, to have actually those 3 governance forums, so to say, where we, on the one side, come together with the businesses to identify the use cases and prioritize them. On the other side, bring together risk, compliance, the control functions at a table to discuss those use cases, not to establish a new governance or new overhead, but to have actually a place to discuss them once and make the process simpler and faster, because our developers don't have to go to 8 different control functions and ask for the approval, but they can just submit it to what we call the AI Oversight Forum. And then last but not least, looking at the technology architecture, which models, which frameworks do we actually want to implement in the technology organization? Because what we have experienced with the entire hype and momentum the technology got is that every developer in the organization wants to develop something with a large language model. And all of a sudden you have hundreds of models, open source models, popping up left and right, all in a development environment, but it's really hard to bring them into production. And therefore we want to establish what we call then an AI platform, where we say, this is our framework, those are the approved models, and if you use them in your applications, it's far easier to get them through the process.
Great. Just to remind everyone, we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A, but if anyone has a question during the session, please put up your hand and I'll try and come to you. Chris, you mentioned earlier about many of the rules already being in place to deal with AI, but regulators are taking a different approach, and as is so often the case with regulation, it's likely that there won't be a single global framework, that regulators will have different approaches. I believe the FCA CEO recently came out and said, we're not going to write specific rules for AI because by the time we've written them, they'll be out of date. So what's the point? Other regulators have taken a slightly different approach. Does that make it much more complicated for banks working in different jurisdictions to navigate?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, the degree to which you have regulatory fragmentation in any field always adds costs, always adds complexity. But I think you can think about this in a relatively simple way, which is the way most countries have approached this starts from the OECD principles. So you end up with really sort of 3 layers of regulation. So you end up with things that are economy-wide. They're largely driven around privacy. They're largely driven around some degree of consumer protection. So they come out of that OECD piece. The second piece is increasingly economy-wide as well, and it's a worry about competition. Will the world of AI be actually dominated by only 2 or 3 very large tech players sitting underneath all this other economic activity? And so you're starting to see that emerge. And then you finally get to the sectors. So in our case, banking, in terms of this conversation. But that is a model that you see sort of pretty much everywhere. I think if you look around the world, there are sort of 3 main schools of thought. So another 3. So one is Europe, where they've definitely gone down the legislative route. We've got the AI Act. It's sort of first really of its kind. And that's attempting to codify a set of approaches across an entire economy. You've got a sort of UK-US version, which is there is some general guidance, but it's pretty soft, and a reliance on the individual regulators to start to bring things to the party. And then finally, you've got what you might call the Asia-Pacific approach, and typified by Singapore, which is there is some more concrete guidance, if you like, but again, it doesn't really have an enormous amount of weight behind it if that guidance is not being followed. They're allowing room for experimentation. But then this is a final set of three, when you then get to financial services, actually I think common across all of them, there's some very simple rules of thumb to begin with, which is firstly, you don't deploy what you don't understand. And that's always been true of any new technology in financial services. The easiest way to get dinged by a regulator is to deploy something you don't actually fully understand and then try and deal with the consequences afterwards. Second thing is, whether it's Europe, whether it's the existing things that are in the sectors, the regulators are looking very closely at, are you monitoring outcomes? So not only can you, to some degree, audit what you're putting in, but also, are you really looking at the outcomes of what are coming out? And do you have that human ability to step in and intervene if things start to go wrong? And there's quite a lot of precedent around those kind of cases. And then finally, there is a sense of the greater the impact and the greater the risk that the outcome could have, the greater the care that's expected. I mean, certainly within the AI Act in Europe, that is absolutely the principle of the more you affect someone's life, the more precautions are expected within that. So there are at least some common starting points that I think people can apply. And as Christoph says, I think for many people who've been in the sector for years, that will feel quite familiar because it's just applied in so many other places.
Christoph, does it feel familiar? Is it as straightforward as it might seem? I mean, and are you deploying anything that you don't yet understand?
Hopefully not. But I mean, it goes along with, general, and I'm responsible for our innovation team as well within Deutsche Bank. And it goes along with the basic principle, right? And it's not only not deploying something you don't understand, but we have always been talking, and I think all financial institutions strive to be innovative and have a tolerance for failure and let people experiment with new technologies and do that. And there is often a misunderstanding between failure and incompetence. Because if we want to be an innovator, we absolutely may have no tolerance for incompetence of people, of decisions. So while I want people to use a risky technology, experiment with it, and maybe fail, maybe succeed, obviously in a controlled development environment, I'm not willing to tolerate people taking decisions because they didn't ask for help or because they took the wrong guidance or whatever. It is important that we educate and empower the people to actually raise their hand and get the knowledge in order to take those business decisions. And I think that's very important if we think about the overall innovation process, and therefore also applies to generative AI as it would for other new technologies, that we create that environment and don't misunderstand what failure means. And failure is a thing you can tolerate, incompetence is not.
And how do you see this, Raquel? And do you think regulators broadly have got it right at the moment? Are they giving banks enough space to innovate, as Christoph says?
Do you want my real answer?
Yeah.
No. I feel that while we have the general concepts of binding regulations, which means those are the thou shalts, and non-binding, which is really those that are more industry guidance, like Chris mentioned earlier. While those two general concepts are known, and as a GSIFI across the board, we're used to the heavy regulation, the heavy binding regulation. The thing that I feel we don't have right yet is more of the consistent, and I won't say centralization, but at least consistency across the regulators. Chris mentioned in the US, we have the executive order and a number of other state-specific guidances around the usage of AI, Utah, et cetera. Then on top of that, we have, privacy laws specific to particular of the 50 states. When you are a global bank with global footprint, it becomes significantly challenging to have to evaluate what the data lineage is, which regulations apply to each. So from a getting it right perspective, I would say we should have more common threads across our regulators. If I look at EU AI Act as another example, it is simplified in the sense of thinking about unacceptable risks and what are common uses of AI. But when you look at that and translating it and using it to assess the impact within the bank internally, it becomes rather challenging. So you have to have a constant team that is doing what we call horizon scanning. We scan for laws, rules, and regulations on a daily basis as it relates to anything impacting data, anything impacting AI. And the piece that Christoph mentioned, I think, really closes the loop significantly. It's not just about knowledge of AI, it's also knowledge of your products, services, and businesses.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, if you develop something, engineering can develop something, and the outputs are content that the engineer doesn't know. If you have incompetence in not looking at those solutions, you'll deliver or deploy something that is not fit to market. So in summary, just really thinking about the binding versus non-binding and finding ways to make sure that you're staying ahead of all the laws, rules, and regs that are applicable to your in financial services.
Is that a fair characterization of the regulatory environment, Chris? And is there room for more common threads across jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think you always find yourself in a conundrum when we're talking about these kind of topics, which is, not just AI, but people will find themselves in a position if you're running a large global institution, you sort of, I think will often encounter a moment of frustration that simply says, these guys are roughly trying to do the same thing. Why don't they line up in the same way? And whether that's ESG, whether that's AI, whatever it might be, the reality is those differences are there. I mean, I think at least on this one, we've started with a set of OECD principles that help provide a bit of guidance and a bit of commonality. IOSCO has come out for securities regulators with something that aims to try and at least have a degree of coordination. But it will always be national governments ultimately that write the laws and give the rules and the regs, and they will differ to circumstances. And so you do have to do all the things that Raquel just said. That's scanning for what the rules are, thinking about how these will interact, having to think in this case about the interaction of data laws, which I think are often many people are finding in practice one of the most complicated things. So it's okay to do this in this jurisdiction, but it's against the law to do it in that jurisdiction. Those kind of things you just have to be very sophisticated about thinking about those things. But then I think that the other piece that I think is often overlooked is people often sort of say, well, I'd really like some sort of black and white hard regs here because that would at least give me the boundaries of my playing field. There'll be lots of other people going into the same sets of government saying, you've got to keep this open to allow for innovation. And so you always have that tension. But then I also think within an individual bank, I mean, some of the practical hardest things I've ever engaged with people on, either as a regulator or as a consultant, have been the things that you see. They're in the grey area, they're in the grey zone, so they're probably you could argue they're legal, and they're definitely technically possible, but then it's about the judgment of senior people around ethically, reputationally. Do we want to be doing this, even if we can see there's some kind of commercial benefit in the short term for maybe pursuing that route, or it makes a lot of sense in some ways. And that's the piece that I think, thinking about your AI ethics is often where, there's no substitute for actually just investing the time and the judgment and really digging into those kind of things. Yeah,
that's really interesting, the issue of AI ethics. I read that lots of the big tech companies employ AI ethicists now to sort of assess, whether a model is morally okay. Are you guys doing that at banks? Do you employ such people? Do you think in that way, Christoph?
Well, we haven't established an AI ethics function or role, but what we have done is actually go through the catalog of how do models behave, how do models react, what is the input and the output, and form some guidelines. how we want to deal with that topic. And the important thing, and I think that is what is really evolving, is that we see with the technology evolving faster every day, so to say, and at least I don't think we have reached the plateau yet, or reached the end of that development. We need to ensure that those processes, those guidelines, are always up to speed with the newest developments, right? You can't define them today and think that they will be steady for the next 6 months or 12 months or whatever the time frame is. So I think that's the biggest challenge all of our control functions have, all of the stakeholders that are involved, including the regulators, to keep up with that speed of development of the technology and always understanding what the inherent risk is that is actually attached to new model versions, open-ended models, and so on and so forth, which is becoming ever more important.
And when we think about the risks created by AI, some of these are risks that banks have dealt with for forever. You know, they're transparency related, security related, but there are other newer risks too, like bias, privacy risks, things like that. How do you approach that and deal with that, Raquel?
So very similarly, and Christoph mentioned evaluating existing controls. One of the things we've done at Bank of New York Mellon, we were a founding member of what's called Project Veritas. And that's a partnership with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which defines a framework around how to manage fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency. We call it the FEAT framework. It's something that foundationally we use across the bank to manage the responsible use of AI solutions. So I think industry partnerships for us are pretty crucial in terms of not only taking a pulse of what's happening in the industry, but also in terms of managing the existing controls and evaluating whether novel risks are posed by AI. We didn't come to be a 240-year-old bank, and happy birthday to BNY this past week, without being very cognizant of ensuring that we have the right guardrails in place. So I would say to the point you mentioned, Tommy, is we have existing processes, but we're constantly reevaluating ourselves to ensure that from a process perspective, we're considering all the risks. We're also looking at, from a business perspective, what are the risks and controls applicable to those businesses, and how can we enable them through solutions like predictive analytics as an example. So.
Does anyone have any questions? Don't be shy. Yes, sure, sir.
The question is around...
Oh, I think you just wait for the microphone, which is on its way. And if you could identify yourself as well, that'd be great. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Mani Janakiraman, Product Manager with the London Stock Exchange Group. The question is around applicability of rules, especially when BNYM, you're present in multiple jurisdictions, as also Deutsche Bank is. How do you approach taking a stake in how you want to organize yourself? For example, as Chris mentioned, that UK is largely sector specific, whereas EU is more a comprehensive regulation model. How do you employ and how do you compute your approach towards addressing these various jurisdictions, both for you and Deutsche as well as for BNYM, please?
Who would like to take it first, Raquel?
Yeah, I can start. So for us, the foundational crux is our data, right? We see data as commercial. It's important to us. It's important to our clients. So we always start with the data that's intended to be used. Is it fit for purpose? Is it aligned to the particular solution that's being leveraged? What are the jurisdictions that are applicable to those particular data sets? Whether or not there's client data involved, and whether or not we have the right to use that client data in any particular way. So it starts with the data before it even evolves to any ideation. And from that perspective, we always have to ensure that the lineage of that data is adequately traced and also managed in terms of the jurisdictions that it's applicable for. So before anybody can get into any sort of ideation with models, as an example, you have to go through what we call our data usage review board. That data usage review board approves the use for purpose, it categorizes the risks, it categorizes the jurisdictions, and it's a very thorough process. Once that's complete, it's ingested into our other subsequent processes, business process change, our CSAs, risk and control self-assessments, SDLC from a development standpoint, model risk. And so I'll say the insertion point is always the data. And if you can trace the data back to where its source is, you can always ensure that the right jurisdictions are applied.
It's a global team that looks at it at a macro level. And then
Absolutely, and it's cross-functional. It includes product, legal, our ethics teams, our privacy teams, all the way runs the gamut of all of the business functions that it would impact.
Christoph.
Yeah, the only thing I might add is that the same holds true then for the output we see from any application or model, right? We need to monitor the output. We need to check whether it is actually suitable for the respective jurisdiction and whether we have to have any end controls before using that output, be it in automation or be it with clients in the interaction. I think that's the one thing I would add.
And one thing, sorry to come behind you, but I forgot to add is just also thinking about the SMR responsibilities, right? Are your subject or your senior management regime members aware of those use cases that are coming through? Because ultimately in those jurisdictions, they're the ones that are going to have to be, accountable and responsible.
I think the EU said recently that it lies with the board, right? It's a board level responsibility. Yeah. So you had a question. Oh.
Yes, Simon Torrance from AI Risk, so maybe relevant. The question is, on strategic risk, how do you manage the risk of being outcompeted?
Who would like to take that on? Christoph, do you want to have a go?
I can take a crack at it. Well, first of all, we need to encourage our people to experiment with the technology. And that might sound like an easy task because everyone in the organization would like to introduce some AI tool at the moment. And I'm the one to blame that they can't. So it's rather something where you need to channel that energy and bring people together to work on certain use cases and avoid duplications along the way. And that's the first step. The second step, obviously, is what we have done in the past couple of years was to invest heavily in our technology foundations as a bank, and so have other banks as well. I.e., we have looked into moving a lot of data points into cloud-based services. We established technology partnerships with a number of large technology firms, and I think this is now the foundation which we can actually use in order to get early access to the technology, because our developer teams can sit together with the Microsofts, the Googles, the Nvidias of this world in order to actually look into the technology before it's generally available. And I think that's very important to have that head start, even though we might not be able to get the technology enterprise ready in the next couple of months. We already can use it and see how it behaves. And I think that is very important.
Great. I believe you had the question.
Hello, it's Luke Verlaine here, UBS. I wanted to ask you about regulators and their regulation of understanding what's underneath the hood of models and how that's going to become less and less possible as we go forward. How much do you think regulators should be shifting to move away from understanding what goes into models and more looking at what the outputs are and the impacts that has on, customers, markets, etc.?
Great question. Christian?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think the first is if you look at how various regulators are evolving, so, the FCA in the UK talking about outcomes-based regulation, those kind of things. Actually, even what's within the AI Act in Europe, you're seeing that shift towards you must be able to monitor and control the outcomes. I think that is a tacit recognition of really understanding exactly what's going on in the middle piece of this in anything like real time is virtually impossible. But there will still be an emphasis on have you got at least the inputs right that you can get right. And I mean, I think that's a mixture of questions around bias and those sorts of things that we've all sort of heard about. It's definitely have you got the right data sets? Where's that come from? Have you got the right permissions? All of those kinds of things. But there is also something about even technical competence about how are you setting these things up. And there are already a couple of cases out there of and this is sort of pre-Gen AI, of just earlier phases of AI being deployed, either where you start to get algorithms begin to appear to conspire with each other on a trading piece. You've had a case like that in New York. You've got in the competition law realm case of a European airline, being first to get there in terms of using algorithms to set pricing on routes live, and then basically price gouging customers and being fined very heavily by the German authorities for doing that. So those kinds of signals about guardrails are already there about the upfront piece. But I agree. I think increasingly you will see this emphasis on how are you rapidly monitoring the outputs and the outcomes, and then intervening if need be as firms to deal with those. I think that's inevitable.
Yeah, for us, we look at our people as our biggest asset. And oftentimes, one of the biggest things me and some of my colleagues see is, well, I'm not a technologist. And so we try to simplify it, and I try to take it to what I call the 6 R's. And I promise not R, because my name is Raquel. So it's really about understanding the risks, right? What are the risks being posed to your business? And going back to the question on strategy that was raised earlier. What is the reward? What are you going to get from it? And does it outbalance what those risks are? And then thirdly, what is the responsibility? What is our responsibility in terms of that particular solution that's used? And then on the output of that, we look at raising any potential risk. We reveal those potential risks and evaluate their root cause, and then we resolve the risk. And so from a life cycle management perspective, we try to make it simple so that all of our employees know what to consider. AI is applicable to any business. It's like a chameleon. It can adapt across the board. And so we try to make sure that the training that we provide our employees are simple. And while we're, sort of relating concepts that our regulators are sharing, we're making it practical and applicable so that all 50,000 of our employees can speak the same language.
Great, thanks. We'll have time for a couple more questions towards the end of the session. I just wanted to ask, it might be really useful to hear a bit about how AI is currently used in banks and what some of the potential use cases are. We're obviously at the early stages of this AI revolution, but Christoph, maybe you could tell us a bit about, is it currently used in what you do at Deutsche Bank, and how?
Yeah, it starts with the question, what do you define as AI, right? And I think we are no different to other financial institutions that have used artificial intelligence, machine learning for decades and implemented that with regards especially for automation. If I look at generative AI in a sense, I think we have a number of use cases live which are using basic models and basic functionality. And we have more than 200 use cases across the bank, across all businesses that are in the pipeline, many of them hopefully going into production within this year. The thing we did in the beginning, or 1.5, 2 years ago, is that we looked at all the ideas that were floating around in the organization and tried to derive certain patterns, usage patterns from those ideas, which brought us to a framework where we have actually identified 10 patterns, including document analytics, including text creation, and so on and so forth, where we selected lighthouse use cases within the bank and pushed them forward and fast-tracked them in order to prove out with all the control functions we just talked about that they are valid, that there is a business case behind it, and that the technology is safe and secure, if you want to call it that way.
Can you give us an example?
A simple example is, as a bank, we are receiving day by day more than, I think, 6,000 handwritten documents from courts around the globe with instructions for garnishment, for certain legal actions. In the past, they have been scanned, and then there has been a human that has actually checked whether we need to take an action. We used large language models now to use the scans of those documents and identify the actions early on. And the actual success rate of identifying whether an action is needed is much higher than what we have seen in the past. So it's an operational efficiency that you see there. Is there an inherent client risk? Yes, but it's limited, and we can control it within the processes that have been established. So it has been a use case where we were very comfortable to introduce that early on compared to other ones which have more inherent risk.
And what about at BMY and Mellon? Are you using generative AI, and if so, how?
Yeah, so we've been using AI-enabled solutions for over 5 years. Obviously, the focus now has become on more generative AI. Some of the things that we do is predictive trade analytics, so evaluating the probability of a trade settling on time, as an example. We also use some of our data sets to identify anomalies or anomaly detection for indicators of risk. We also look at probability forecasting in terms of, evaluating whether or not the ability for a trade to settle against that cash balance are things that we're doing across the firm. So one of the biggest things, similar to what Christoph talked about, is in 2023, we created an ideation, basically, the ability for any employee to submit an idea for how AI can be leveraged to enable their business solutions. Collected hundreds of those ideas and started looking at the common themes for what those things were, and things like predictive analytics became those common themes. And from those common themes, we then took those particular use cases and ingested them into what we call our AI hub. That AI hub then helps to bring those solutions to life through the ideations of our businesses, through the collaboration of our product managers, as well as the involvement of our relationship managers and sales stakeholders.
And as data becomes ever more important as a sort of driving force in AI and some of this technology, how do you deal with issues around data theft, data leakage, and concerns from clients and customers about that?
Yeah, so I think the concept of the potential for data leakage has been quite around for quite some time. I think what's evolved is the threats to it, whether it's deep fakes or, potential more sophisticated phishing scams. So one of the things that we do is constantly evaluate the threat landscape. Our cybersecurity team is on par with making sure that we understand what are in the OWASP top 10. And for those of you that don't know, yes, they focus on, security vulnerabilities, but they also publish a list of the top 10 risks and threats as it relates to AI solutions, as well as large language models. So staying abreast of what's going on in the industry is one of the best ways that we do that. And from a data exfiltration perspective, we always follow the principle of least privilege. That means that even when you're enabling some of these large language solutions via ChatGPT or otherwise, that there's layered levels of access. There's that general data layer, as we use as an example, that anyone in the company can access, and then that tiers into specific quadrants of the various types of, whether it's highly confidential, MNPI, or client data. And we make sure that fine-grained entitlements are aligned to the respective use cases for those data sets. Lastly, I think human in the loop is crucial, right? One of the biggest ways that you can protect our data is to ensure that people are educated to understand that any output requires a human in the loop. Everybody, I won't say everybody, but generally most people understand the concept of tools to leverage data exfiltration from a network perspective. Those still apply. It's just really fine-tuning it to address the risks that AI is posing.
Okay. And sorry, did you want to go in?
I would love to add one thing, because we just touched upon human in the loop. There's another concept which for years we have communicated to our organization, that human is always the weakest link if we talk about especially cybersecurity. And I think that's a very important one, because there's a risk that if we do not make tools available for our employees, they will just look for other ways to use that technology, whether it being copying the text into your private phone or taking a picture or whatever. And all of a sudden you have data leakage risk, which is not in your controlled environment. And I think that is very important to continue that education and make people aware that they just cannot and must not take data out of the controlled environment and put it into ChatGPT or whatever tool they fancy in their private life, because it's different if you want to use it in a corporate context.
Chris, let me ask you, what's your big fear about the use of AI in banking and some of the consequences? Let's be honest, banks haven't had the best track record of self-policing when it comes to new technologies and the use of data. So what's your big concern, if you have?
So I think I would say there's two, right? So I think the first piece is, I've already said it, people kind of do the, what do my lawyers say, what do my technologists say, and they forget the ethical component in the middle. Right. I mean, I think in terms of not only reputation and commercial damage, but also in terms of, where will you see knee-jerk responses from governments to close loops? It's undoubtedly that's the space where those problems will start from. And, I've personally, I won't go into them now because of the time, but I mean, I've been involved in, real life questions where you can legitimately have some people within an organisation saying, this is fine, others saying, we shouldn't touch this with, we shouldn't just do this, it's wrong.
Related to the use of AI?
Yeah, related to the outputs of AI. So those kind of things I think, you need to guard against. There's one other point, though, that I wanted to just squeeze in before we stop. All of our conversation has been around the negatives. And, inevitably the work of lots of regulators is about trying to stop bad things happening. But there's also some incredibly positive cases around the use of AI from a risk perspective. So we're already seeing it around financial crime, around counter-terrorist financing, around fraud. Actually, AI being introduced into those systems is proving really powerful. And I think one of the things we just have to try and balance in this conversation is not allowing the worry about the risk of the things that can go wrong, blinding people to the fact that actually there's a lot of things here that potentially could go right as well. And that, for me, is a fear in this conversation, that everything just purely becomes about the negative. And we need to make sure the positives are seen as well.
Okay. We're running low on time, but if anyone has a question, please put up your hand. Yeah, sir.
Hi, my name's Sajjad Khan. I'm an AI transformation consultant. Just picking up on that last point, Chris, we've worked, a lot of us in this audience, with technology, but I think very few of us will have ever got to a point where half the people think AI will destroy the world and the other half think it will save it. Where do you think, in that last point, which I absolutely agree with, there are so many positive use cases, but everyone's sometimes biases towards risk and the doom scenarios, which is understandable in a highly regulated sector. In terms of the regulation, do you feel that the regulators are in a catch-up mode because they missed out on a lot of what had happened over the last 10 years? Or do you genuinely think they think AI is such a new technology that it could cause systemic risks to the world?
Wow, that's an enormous question in 1 minute, 47 seconds to go. And we've got to wrap up. So, I think it's probably fair to say, you'd have to have them here and ask them, but, inevitably, I think regulators normally have a degree of catch-up with the bleeding edge of where the industry might be. And that's right. I think we don't necessarily want a world where the regulators are defining what can and can't be done. There's a degree of allowing that flexibility in terms of innovation. I also think, this messaging you're getting from the regulators that says, we've experienced some of this, we've got some tools already, is true. I've dealt with those cases 5, 6, 7 years ago where you can see how those principles would flow through to Gen AI. I think the piece, though, where you will see action, where you will see people being concerned is, does Gen AI in particular allow the acceleration of trends. So, where people will worry about it as a systemic risk is, does this allow something that we would have seen in the past and could have got our arms around in a few days? Can it happen in a few minutes, in a few hours? And those will be the places where we'll see regulation intervene, and that's it sort of doing its job, I think. But I also think, there are a smart bunch of people around the world looking at these things from the regulatory side of the fence. I do think there is a degree of balance out there, particularly those that are interested, for example, in fin crime, looking for the good things. But I think it's also attendant on everybody here to try and make sure that, the case for the positive is also being made alongside some of the killer robot scenarios that are easy to talk about in the press.
You've timed your answer to perfection, and we are out of time. Thank you very much for everyone for watching, and thank you for our panellists. Thanks a lot. Cheers.